This show does not constitute legal advice and is for educational purposes only. We are always available to field questions. However, until you have entered into a written agreement, your communications are not confidential and we are not acting on your behalf. Hi, welcome back to Man vs. Land. I'm Sarah Holland, your host, and today we have with us Steve Whitman from Resilience Planning and Design. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and letting folks know who you are and what you do.
Sure.
Great.
So we're actually located here in Plymouth, New Hampshire. We share an office with Sarah for her Plymouth office. And Resilience Planning and Design is a private consulting firm. We offer community planning, environmental planning, affordable housing planning services, kind of a range of things to communities. A lot of towns and cities throughout New England. Our work is primarily in New Hampshire, but we go to each of the other northern New England states, occasionally to Massachusetts and other states. And we're working with communities on these complex problems like the one we'll talk about today.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. And Steve is no stranger to Man vs. Land. He was here in our initial season, so we're so excited to have him back to talk more about housing. We have this housing crisis in New Hampshire. It is not unique to New Hampshire. It's happening all over. And you have a unique perspective because you work with towns and you hear the conversations and the different viewpoints and positions as to adding additional housing, how we get there, or the standpoint that we should not add additional housing. What is the overall sentiment in the state relative to housing in the communities that you've worked in? And I know it's complex.
Yeah, I'm glad we have more than 5 minutes to talk about this. I think we're so far behind. It can be overwhelming to people who now understand the problem and are willing to take action. We have a lot of community members who are getting involved in their own town or city, trying to educate themselves and educate other residents and business owners and employees who work there who can't find housing, and trying to look at the range of solutions. And there are a tremendous number of solutions coming out because so many communities are focused on kind of being more active in implementing change. There still is resistance that takes all shapes and sizes, and often it's from people who are very housing secure, don't necessarily have the perspective or the stories of people who are suffering, who they might very much want to keep or see come to their community, and don't understand the economics. I think a lot of the terminology, some of which we can talk about today, there are a lot of myths around it about who's represented and what people like that will do in our communities. In a lot of cases, the people we're talking about are here. They're active members of our communities of all ages. Yeah. And so it's really complex. And it can be kind of overwhelming for people to dip their toe in and try to get an understanding of the severity of the problem.
Yeah.
So segments like this can be helpful, just to kind of talk about it in plain language.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of put some faces to, you know, these folks that we're talking about. They're really kind of the essential workforce of our communities, right? These are our teachers, our firefighters, our hospital staff.
Yep.
You know, so these are folks that we want to keep in our communities, and not having enough options for housing is really that struggle, because as we know in our life, we change and we grow, and you know, our family size grows and we go through hardship, and you know, what housing looks like for us throughout our lifetime can be very different from one person to the next. Yep. But it may not be fair to ask those members of our community that are so integral when they're going through those transitions that they may need to exit our community because there's no housing for them.
No, and I think the point you're making is important, because as we look across communities and we inventory the housing stock, what's the standard housing stock we see? It's single family homes, often, you know, of a certain size on a certain acreage, and that puts those at a price point that's now out of reach of many people. Yeah. So we've had and I think it worked for a long time, maybe for the majority of people. Yeah. But we've had this kind of one size fits all housing scheme. Now to flip it the other way and say that everyone wants to live in a 32 unit apartment building is probably unfair either. Absolutely. Or in a large condo development. But there are so many choices between single-family home and large multifamily building. There are many, many choices in between. And they can be selected as options, like tools in a toolbox for a community to keep the character or context of their community and have these places fit in seamlessly, address the need. So there are a lot more options than choice A or choice B.
Yeah, absolutely. And to provide a little bit of context, if I can, so we have some definitions, or we have some terms that are just kind of out there that may be conflated in one way or the other. So the first is workforce housing. And there are definitions relative to workforce housing in our RSAs that are at the state level in our rule of law, right? And so it's defined, and maybe we can put a slide on the screen so you guys don't have to take notes. But for a renter, it's a family of 3 making 60% of the area median income. And I will say that in New Hampshire, that the median income currently is, well, the annual current average household income is $91,000. So they would be making 60% of that for that to be an affordable workforce housing unit. For you to purchase a workforce housing unit as an owner, a family of 4 has to make 100% of the median income for it to be considered available, or affordable, which is $91,000.
So you'd have to have a family of 4 with a total combined income of $91,000 to be workforce housing.
To be workforce housing, yeah. And when we talk about affordable housing separate from workforce, and workforce housing has categorizations, right? So it's like your starter homes. It also includes ADUs, right? Townhouses, condos, and apartments. So it's both for rentals and for purchase. So it covers kind of the gamut there. But when we take out the workforce piece and just add affordable housing, right now the average purchase price in New Hampshire is $525,000. That's bananas, folks.
And out of reach of so many.
And
households.
out of reach of so many. So the average household making $91,000 cannot afford the average price point in New Hampshire currently. They would have to make somewhere between $132,000 if they have a decent amount of savings, and $165,000 a year to afford that house of $525,000. And that is, it's hard for some folks to wrap their head around. So it's not low income housing. It is not transient housing, right? This is our workforce, people. This is me, this is you, right? This is all of us in our community, and we need to kind of wrap our heads around our neighbors struggling to be able to stay in our community, and we need them.
I think it's worth repeating what you said again, because you just said basically the average household in New Hampshire can't afford the average priced house.
Yeah.
And so that is the disconnect that we're talking about in so many communities, and it can look different ways.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways to start to address it, but it's a broad problem. We're
Yeah.
not talking about a small subsection of the population. We're talking about many people.
Right. Absolutely. And just thinking about our own life cycle, right? So currently, I'll use myself as an example. We have 3 children, and they're all adults. And 2 of them are currently living with me, gainfully employed. One is going to be moving out of state very shortly to go back to school. One has purchased a house outside of the state as well, because there's nothing here. And the other one is trying to save to buy whatever they can possibly purchase in order that makes sense for them, right? Because they don't want to get into something that they're not going to be able to sustain. Right? Because that's setting folks up for failure, and that's not fair for anyone to do.
Sure.
Yeah. So in order to keep them within our house, right? Because we've lived comfortably there with all 5 of us for some time, and we can divide up the house if we were permitted to do so by the town. So talking about like regulations and what our options are there on our own property to provide private space that gives us all the safety and security that we're looking for, but affordable options.
Right.
So what are some solutions that you're seeing kind of in your work?
I think what you're encountering, more and more people are encountering. So as we work with towns and cities in New Hampshire specifically, a lot of times the staff are saying that they're getting calls with requests for how, within the existing regulations, how they can create a situation for multi-generational living. So they might already live in a single family home and there are parents or children who are housing challenged or housing insecure, and
Absolutely.
they are considering all kind of living with each other, but everybody kind of wants their own private space, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And so communities are getting these demands. In a lot of cases, the regulations didn't anticipate this, and change can be slow at the municipal level because you not only have to have all the conversations that can lead to the crafting of the right rules and procedures, but then you have to convince the voters to adopt them. And
Absolutely.
most communities do that once a year.
Yeah.
So if you kind of miss the mark, you may have, set yourselves
Yeah.
back for a while. So what we're seeing is through some of the changes that the state has brought forward with permitting accessory dwelling units, that has really forced the conversation in a lot of places. And we're not seeing communities overrun with applications for accessory dwelling units,
Yep.
separate living units, whether they be attached or detached, depending on what the town allows. But we're seeing some, and we're seeing them done well. They're not inexpensive to do, so
Yeah.
that's a challenge. That's another barrier for folks. But it's starting to dispel some of the fear. It's also very interesting in some communities. There's a lot of fear about what these smaller, often 1,000 square foot units will look like and what they'll do to their community. And yet you could go build a 2,000 or 3,000 square foot house, and nobody is concerned about that or says anything about
Right.
it. And you don't typically regulate the appearance of a home.
Right.
Yeah.
Or its occupants.
Or who's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, or who's
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. Because that can change over time, and that's been my experience in having these conversations when folks talk about how the community feels,
Yeah.
the transformation, and it's not going to feel the same. Like, I know that my community or my neighborhood just felt different as our kids started aging, when they, started having friends over and then started driving, and the car sounds and it became a mechanics workshop in our driveway, and people were over and everybody was testing thing out. And I'm just like, but it's going to end. It has its own life
Right.
cycle. It's going to kind of go away. So let's talk a little bit more about some solutions that we can
Sure.
maybe start thinking about, and not that we want to provide some options for you guys to kind of noodle over a little bit, and have conversations with your communities. We did end up getting one of the HOP grants, the community that I live in, and we did do I want to call it a charrette, but a roundtable discussion about housing and what the community looks like, and having these conversations kind of on a high level over my career. I was prepared to battle when I went into those, but I was very pleasantly surprised by there were people around the tables that I had not seen in my community before.
Yeah.
That they were just like, this is my chance to talk about these needs that I have and
Right.
that I want to stay here. And it was so nice, so refreshing, and it was very pro-housing. But again, once everybody gets to that mindset, okay, yeah, let's add more housing, it's how. How do
Sure.
we do it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So there are so many resources now, and definitely don't want to get tangled up in like jargon.
Sure.
But one of the concepts that's been touted for a few years that can kind of help encapsulate a lot of the solutions is this idea of missing middle housing.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure it's a term you've come across
Yep.
in your work. But the idea is that in a lot of communities, it's the option A and B again, right? We permit single family homes. And then in some portion of the community, you have to allow for multifamily according to workforce housing law in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And other states have similar types of things. So you have most everywhere, you can have a single family home. In some portions of the community, you can have a multifamily building that could be for rent or for sale condos. But the middle either is not mentioned or is not permitted. The 2 units, the triplex, the quadplex, so these smaller 2, 3, 4 unit buildings that could also be condos or could be rentals.
Yeah.
The accessory dwelling unit, tiny homes and cottages, cottage courts, smaller homes clustered together with shared
Yeah.
parking. Like a lot of these more creative things that could often be invisible to the passerby and could fit in the context of the community and meet the needs of a young professional, someone who's working in the community, someone who's
Yeah.
an empty nester or retired.
Right.
They can kind of fit lots of different walks of life.
Yeah.
If they're not permitted, or if there are lots of additional regulatory layers added to them, people don't do it. You know,
Yeah.
they inquire, like you and I talked about before filming, they inquire about the process. If the process is onerous and they're already struggling to just live their life,
Yes.
it stops there.
Yeah.
If the process is onerous and expensive, it stops there. So we're seeing communities talk about these types of units, change their regulations to make them allowable, and in some case incentivize them.
Yeah.
And so incentivizing it might be making the regulatory process really clear, user-friendly.
Yep.
Some communities, largely outside of New Hampshire, are actually providing a tax or financial incentive for a homeowner who's going to be creating units that will then house workers who are going to live and work in the community. Because at the end of the day, these numbers are an economic issue.
Yeah.
You know, if New Hampshire businesses can't find workers because workers can't find housing, it's a big issue.
It's a
for the state.
huge issue, and there are many businesses in our communities, locally, central New Hampshire, that are struggling to find employees, and they are trying their best to create housing.
Right.
Which means that they are going to be purchasing, and they have, I've seen this happen in our marketplace, they've purchased multifamily buildings, they've purchased cottages and,
Yeah.
and whatnot, cottage communities, in order to house their employees, which for me creates another concern. What happens when those employees no longer work there, right?
Yeah.
Are they being held hostage by their living situation?
Absolutely.
And I think in our history as a country, that's been a thing,
Yeah.
and we don't want to repeat that. So the other piece so I teach pre-licensing courses and for real estate, the new real estate agents that are coming in, and we have these conversations about like life cycles of housing, how to value housing,
Yeah.
excuse me, and what affects the value on housing. And that's what we're seeing right now in the marketplace, and why the median purchase price is so high right now is because it's the concept of supply and demand. Right? We have very little supply, and the demand is very high. So we need to add more units. And I think the number at this moment right now is about 25,000 units that we're short in New Hampshire. So if we don't want the prices to be high, then let's make 50. Let's give folks some options, right? Those prices will come down. Of course, if you're sitting in your home, that is your retirement asset. You're like, no, don't affect my price. But those are things that we need to balance,
Yes.
right? Absolutely. And it's a very complex issue that is not black and white,
Right.
but it involves our neighbors and our children and ourselves, right? That we need to think more about that. And when you said that, like what we had talked about prior to filming, when folks look at these regulations, they're already so complex to read
Sure.
as it is for someone who's not in it. And I read them all day, you read them all day long. And sometimes for us, we're like, what? I don't even know what that means. How do we navigate this?
Right.
So for the average community member to look at the process of adding an ADU to their house, an accessory dwelling unit, formerly called the in-law apartment,
Yeah.
that they may just look at that and go, ooh, like there's a lot of work to be done to prepare your application, to just submit it and have time available to be able to answer any questions from the entity that's going to be reviewing it and deciding the fate of that application. And you're doing this all for a maybe, right?
Right.
And
unless it's permitted by right. And
if
some
it's permitted by
communities
right.
are now realizing that those barriers are the
Yeah.
reason they're not seeing applications.
Yeah,
And so they're
absolutely.
making the process easier.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
And that's what we want. We want the process to be a little bit easier, and for communities to be open to the conversation of adding more housing instead of just, no, we're not going to have this discussion, right? So
I think what New Hampshire's done successfully, and what we'll start to see pay off now, is this whole program of these housing opportunity planning grants.
yeah,
And the housing funding that's been used to leverage developers creating
Yep.
some workforce housing units as part of the other market rate units. it's led to a tremendous amount of conversation and education. So there are probably very few planning board members and local planning and regulatory staff, code enforcement, building inspectors, folks like that don't understand the problem to some degree and have also experienced it personally.
Yeah.
And so there's a collective kind of awareness of the issue that probably didn't exist a couple years ago.
Yeah.
The problem's gotten more severe over the last couple of years,
Yeah,
and
and I
as
think-
you pointed out, it will get more severe without action.
Yeah, and it was set on a fast track through COVID, right? Because folks needed their own spaces. They were
Yes.
working, they were working from home and they needed quiet spaces, and then they're like, oh, I just need my own space, right? So that we were already headed that direction. This is not something that happened overnight.
Yeah.
So it's going to take a long time for us to reverse the effects, but I think that things are moving in the right direction as far as conversation goes. And I do also want to validate, I've had many conversations with folks in other communities where they're like, oh, but then we have to increase, our police force or our firefighters, we have to increase the capacity there to make sure that our communities are safe because we're going to have more people, more housing, more infrastructure. And yeah, that does come along with it. And we're not dismissing that at all, because again, it's a very dynamic issue that needs all voices around the table to be able to get us going in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What else do you want to touch on?
I don't know, please have the conversations. No, I think, are there any, you talked about a little bit about some creative solutions that you've seen throughout the country. Are there any that you're just like, oh my God, that would be amazing if this happened here?
I think it depends on the context of the community. So like we're working in some urban centers in the southern part of New Hampshire and in Maine. And the solutions looked at there might be different than in a small town. Like we just finished a housing project for Lancaster.
Excellent.
And so in some of the urban areas, they're recognizing that, for one, the population that is looking for housing may be younger. It may not want a 3,500 square foot house. We're also working in Bedford that has a lot of those. And so they're trying to think about what is the future of their existing housing stock, and do they continue to be single family? Do they become smaller units within the same building and they're condoed? And that's what young professionals want. They want the mobility. They are working from home and they want to get out and recreate when they're not working. And so just the fact that there are so many different ways to live and different types of homes that people are seeking. In some cases, we're seeing a return to kind of shared facilities. So some of the urban areas are looking at building places, maybe not the employees building it, the employers building it, but maybe private sector folks, where all you really wanted is your private room, shared kitchen at a much lower cost than the $3,000 or whatever a rent would go for there. And so this kind of idea of shared facilities, congregate housing, the old rooming house kind of idea, is coming back with like a modern flair.
Nice.
And that meets a small segment of the population maybe.
Right, yeah.
And so I think it's both the range of housing types that are possible and then the way they're configured on the landscape. And so in a really rural community, you do get in a lot of conversations about the fear of how it will change the character of the community. These accessory dwelling units, whether they be above your garage, attached to your house, out back, often are unseen. The town of Meredith has a long history of using units like that to meet kind of the rental need. And I think it just wasn't noticed by people until the conversation at the state started to happen. And the same with duplexes. The duplexes don't have to look like the traditional side-by-side. They can look like a traditional New Englander. They can be one in the front, one in the back, one upstairs, one downstairs. Whatever the solutions are, what we're finding is mixing them in with the existing housing stock is beneficial, because then you get people of different income levels, different walks of life, different ages living in proximity to each other and building community.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, building community, that's perfect. That's where you get to know your neighbors, right? And you feel connected. Yeah, I love that.
And that's your social safety network, more than anything.
Absolutely.
One of the other things, there are non-regulatory things towns are doing too. In the Conway area in Jackson, they started doing this a long time ago, like a decade ago, this idea of home sharing. And so, older adults that may be living alone and want to stay in the community and have a house can be paired. It's almost like a dating app. But you can be paired with somebody who maybe also be an older adult who you'd be compatible with. And
love
then
that.
you're providing a housing solution for them. They're providing some company and support for you. But in some cases, you're being paired with a younger person. So maybe someone who's locating in the area, having trouble finding housing, and is maybe physically fit and can do some of the things that you no longer want to do or can't do.
Yeah.
And so these home share agencies have been set up to try to make sure that people are safe and from both the homeowner and the renter perspective.
Yep.
They're compatible, their lifestyles work well together, and it's a really creative solution. And some of that can happen just through community, through who we know and how we talk about, the people's needs.
Oh, that's such a great solution. Yeah, and again, it's just one of the tools in the toolkit, right? To kind of get us to where we need to go. And when you mentioned Conway, it made me think of the whole short-term rental thing, and very taboo subject, as you know, in the state. And that is also one of the arguments that a lot of folks say is, get rid of short-term rentals and then we'll solve the housing crisis. Well, when I mentioned that today, in this moment, we need 25,000 units, that's additional than already exists.
Right.
So that is, if we take folks or we ban short-term rentals, that's going to just, solve a little minuscule problem.
Makes a
but
dent.
But it's, and these folks are generally doing it. Yes, we have institutional investors, but we also have folks that are doing it to be able to afford the place that they are going to move to.
Yeah.
And part of my conversation for a very long time with folks is most of us are not from here.
Right.
We came from other places.
Right.
And that's just how it's been. So people tend to gravitate to the place that they enjoy the most, that they feel the most at home, and it may not be where they came from, it just may be where they're going. And we should welcome that, right? We have an economic initiative at the state of New Hampshire to get more businesses here. Cool. Love that, but where are these folks going to live, and and how do we keep the folks that are already here? So, no solutions today in this conversation. It's more just like validating everybody's thoughts and concerns and maybe adding a little bit different perspective for you to consider, and some other options for you to have discussions about around the table.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the takeaways I would hope is that there are a range of solutions, right?
Yep.
They can fit the context of your place, but that every sector needs to be involved. Like some residents who have an interest or the ability need to step up and create some of these units,
Right.
the accessory dwelling unit, the duplex, whatever. And they may do that because they know the person who's housing insecure and needs the assistance. So some residents need to do it. We need the development community. And in the past, we lost a lot of folks in construction trades. We lost a lot of general contractors.
Yeah.
There wasn't a high demand for new units. Now there is, and there's definitely seems to be a challenge in kind of getting back up to speed with having enough folks who can build quality structures and want to go through the regulatory process, and that they're going to work with communities who are welcoming them to be there, and then they're going to want to do it the way the community wants.
Yeah.
So we need them. We need towns. Towns and cities are starting to think about the role that they can play. In some cases, they're donating land to make a project affordable, because the financial gap between workforce housing unit and a market rate unit, it's going to be important in the development scenario.
Right.
And so there are all these different players and others. Your profession has been really important to educate people on what their options are, to talk about where our challenges are.
Yeah.
And so we need like all hands on deck.
Yeah.
And I think we've been starting to see that.
Yeah, and I love that. I just love seeing, the people that are having the conversation, right? And willing to listen.
Yeah.
A willingness to listen to your community members and their struggles and their viewpoints, right? Because those are things that maybe it comes from a lot of fear, right? And it's a vulnerable position for folks to share their fear about these changes that are happening around them in communities that now look different than they did when they first, moved here.
Right.
So we need to be respectful of that and yeah, have respectful conversations and see
Yeah.
how we can move forward.
I mean, it touches so many of us. I mean, I will admit that most of my adult professional life as a working professional in the state of New Hampshire, first working for the state of New Hampshire and then working in consulting, married to a professional school teacher, we fell below the workforce housing household income, average.
Yeah.
So we fell below that, but housing was cheaper.
Yes.
And so we were able to make it work. We were able to successfully be homeowners, even at times when choice might have been limited.
Mm-hmm.
But the tables have turned so much now that the gap we just talked about earlier, the fact that the average household can't afford the average home, is a big shift.
It is a big shift. Yeah. And it is a vulnerable one, right?
Yes.
Because the folks that are making decisions, sitting around the table, having these conversations, internally they may go, ooh, that's me, or it could be me, So it's helpful to know this information, to ask questions if you don't know a definition.
Right.
If you are hearing conflicting information, let's go to the source, right? I work with, I look at laws and rules, and you do the same, policy. Yeah. And there is a resource most often that we can all use as a baseline to have these conversations. So let's find that and help our neighbors, help our communities. Yeah. And it makes it stronger. Every community that has, just this life cycle housing is a stronger community. And economically, the tax base is better, quality of life is better,
yep.
And opportunity for everyone. And, just elementary school reminder that shelter is a basic human need, right? And if we feel safe and secure in our housing, we can do amazing things.
No, it's so true.
Yeah.
It's so true. One of the things these housing opportunity grants have done is allow for a lot of research that's both New Hampshire based and community based. Yep. And what's been surprising to a lot of decision makers is when we do the research and we crunch the numbers for their community, in a lot of cases now, the housing units we're talking about trying to create actually are tax positive. And so it used to be that there was a lot of fear that the cost of services and the increase in services, these kind of demands on services, would make that situation not beneficial.
Right.
And so communities for a long time kind of were fearful of housing being constructed, and both the sprawl impact of just spreading out across the landscape and then the financial impact. But things have changed in a lot of ways, and the cost of some of these units and what they're taxed at. It's important to look in your own community at your own data and see what the realities are, because it may be different. But in a lot of communities, it's actually beneficial.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I've had that
it's another
conversation with my with one of my selectmen as well, because that is a big concern that they hear. They're just like, oh, we don't want more, more units because kids in schools. Well, we've done studies on that, and that's not the case. That doesn't increase the cost because most of those are fixed costs, right? It doesn't matter how many kids we have. And those enrollments are going down anyway. But it does add to the taxable inventory in a community. And as long as you don't go crazy and, totally increase your community complex and everything else that's going to add to your budget, then it can be tax positive.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, so great to have this conversation with you.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about this. It's an important topic.
Appreciate it. Yeah. So thank you all for your time, and thanks to Steve for joining us again and having this conversation. And we welcome you back anytime to Man vs. Land. These episodes are available on Pemmy Baker TV as well as online on YouTube. So share these conversations with your friends, with your community members, and let's have this discussion and see how many folks we can keep home and or bring back home into our communities and make sure that we are thriving in New Hampshire. Thank you all.